back to the UK, the spring statement by Chancellor Rachel Reeves has just been put out. I'm going to read a summary of some of the budget, and then I guess we'll discuss some of the sort of interesting points. So firstly, welfare cuts. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, said Labour's party of work. She proposed cutting the number of people qualified for personal independence payments, PIP, saying that people are wasting their potential, they're wasting their futures, they're wasting their lives, being dependent on the government, to save the UK about 4.8 billion by 2029. The OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they've halved their growth forecasts for this year, but they've increased them for the following few years, which we might be sceptical about. We can discuss. No tax increases. Seems like a good thing. Well, no tax increases, as stated by Rachel Reeves, but promising to use cutting-edge technology to clamp down on tax avoidance, to make a further 1 billion. In terms of spending, defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP, funded by international aid cuts, which again seems good and aligned with the sort of general mood of the country. Scrapping NHS England, which I was happy to see, to give more money back to patients. NHS England obviously being this quango full of people employed to do who knows what, with lots of replicated sort of responsibilities. Civil service cuts of 15%. Civil service costs being cut by 15%. I don't know how that will be achieved to save 2.2 billion. If it's just sort of firing half the civil service, maybe you could be on board with that, but I don't think that's what they're proposed to do. And then various other promises to increase the efficiency of state provisions and public services using technology. And then lastly is quite interesting on planning. The OBR said that the government planning reforms will permanently increase GDP by 0.4% by 2030, and house building will reach a 40-year high, hitting 305,000 homes a year by the end of the forecast period. So that's 1.3 million homes in the UK over the next 5 years. I think Labour promised 1.5 million homes being built, but 1.3 million homes is quite close to that. Do any of those raise concerns for you?
All of them. So we might have to go through some of these line by line. You might have to remind me. Okay. So first of all, if they're pledging to cut £5 million...
Welfare cuts. Well, we can start with welfare cuts.
Yes.
Good?
It would be
Bad.
good. It would be good. However, not drastic enough.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, this was mainly instigated because Max Tempers, again on X, probably the most powerful Twitter account in the UK at this point, caused a firestorm about mobility vehicles being, let's say, dubiously claimed by people that have new ADHD diagnoses ever since the pandemic and are now getting brand new BMWs. And so there are quite a few people that are doing that. So they're clamping down on things like that.
Is it something like 20% of people, or, of new cars being bought based off this mobility scheme? Or is that how many people are claiming benefits broadly in the country?
No. So I don't know about the percentage of cars, but it's 25% of all people of working age, that's 18 to 64, are claiming disability benefits.
Right.
So a quarter of the working age population. I think it's 1 in 8 young people are not in education, employment, or training, so they're NEETs.
So this is a case where Fraser Nelson's concerns on an issue may actually be right on point.
It would be right on point if he wasn't also in favour of importing millions of foreign nationals every year, insisting they're as British as you and me. 95% of visas every year are given to non-net taxpayers. So, unfortunately, he's very concerned about the sort of sewage that's coming out the pipe, but doesn't want to turn the tap off. Mm-hmm. So that's an issue. Also, the 5 billion in cuts is nullified by, I think, an 18 billion in unexpected borrowing, additional to what was forecast. So this sort of black hole, this fictional 22 billion pound black hole, is very much one of Labour's own making. Also, spending is rising to 1.3 trillion. So keeps going up. Debt to GDP has fallen just below parity of 100%. It's about 98.8%. But then remember from the autumn statement, which has been the entire cause for growth projections to halve in less than 6 months from 2 to 1%, Rachel Reeves says that we're only growing GDP because Labour's mentality is if the public sector spends more, that's more economic activity, therefore more GDP. So GDP per capita has stagnated, if not fallen, since the 2008 financial crash. But by spending 2% on government departments increased every single year, GDP is going up.
And this is the Treasury brain problem, right? This is the problem of our sort of political class. How do you fudge the GDP figures?
Yes.
When really the metric that is most affect people's lives is, how much money they have in their pocket, GDP per capita, and how GDP is divvied up among the population.
And this GDP
and funnily
figure
enough, that actually goes down when you add a lot more people into the population.
Yeah, and that GDP figure is actually going to be the reason why they're not going to be able to do the civil service cuts. Now, bear in mind, we, per capita, have a larger civil service than communist China. And that has gone up only under the Conservatives and has now ballooned increasingly under Labour. There's lots of Labour ministers who have said they believe the public sector is more productive than the private sector, so they'll face internal resistance from their own party, but they'll also face internal resistance from the civil service for two reasons. First of all, any attempt to interfere with the civil service is impossible because of the Tony Blair Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which puts the Civil Service Code into law, which means that the civil service are a neutral body, which means that any interference in the civil service, its structure, its personnel, its appointments by an elected minister is politicising the civil service, so they're basically unsackable, no matter what they do. This is why the likes of Sue Gray had to have a very long holiday in the Bahamas and then get appointed to the Lords in order to be gotten rid of as Keir Starmer's chief of staff. And the other thing is that civil service members get a year's severance pay. So any cuts to the civil service don't show up in the annual budget. And all of these growth projections are done yearly. So if you decide to say, well, I'm going to cut this government department, not only do you face resistance from the civil service in terms of civil service code, but the OBR will say, well, there's no point because it's not going to factor into our short-term growth projections, so find the cut somewhere else, which is why they can only go for pensions or things like the winter fuel allowance or something like foreign aid. Now, foreign aid usually requires an act of parliament to do it. With a parliamentary majority, they can. But the foreign aid cuts are actually very deceptive as well because the major line item of foreign aid is illegal migration. It was £14.4 billion in 2023. So the majority of our foreign aid is spent internally on illegal migrants in Britain. Under Yvette Cooper's plan...
And that's housing them in various hotels.
Legal aid fees, everything. Under Yvette Cooper's plan, that's being moved to the welfare budget, which one, means they don't have to publish the figures, but two, as Conservative MP Nick Timothy has costed, according to Cooper's own statements, is going to increase the bill to £32.7 billion every year. So it's going to keep going up. And it's going to go up even more because we're now getting record numbers of them crossing over, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the idea that this money is going from the foreign aid budget, which we're wasting overseas on these nations that hate us, and is going to go into the defence budget, arming us against those nations anyway, it's for the birds, and it's falling afoul of Sir Neil Ferguson's law, which says that any great power that spends more on servicing its debt than on its foreign aid budget, on its defence budget, rather, is no longer going to be a great power. Do you know how much we're spending on servicing our debt every year?
Go on.
£100 billion, dwarfing our defence budget. The welfare budget is also major factors higher under the Conservative and Labour governments than our defence budget. So none of these things spell fiscal responsibility, sustainability, or a government that's interested in fixing those things. The final thing I'll say as well about the cutting of NHS England, fine, I'm all for cutting unnecessary bureaucratic bloat and waste. But the NHS, as I've written about for Courage Media, is about to embark on an almost £11 million multi-year clinical trial into puberty blockers after Health Secretary Wes Streeting just claimed credit for banning them. And this means that hundreds more children are going to be subjected to medical experimentation, despite us and the Tavistock Clinic themselves knowing as early as 2014 that these puberty blockers are given out on the false premise that you can change sex, that they cause brittle bones, they cause infertility, they cause cancer, they cause atrophied brain development. So what quite this £11 million is being spent on, other than to medically experiment on more confused children, is beyond me. And you could save £11 million and do the right thing tomorrow by cancelling it, but instead they just want to trim around the edges and cut people from non-frontline roles in NHS England and then claim credit for reducing the civil service.
Right, so you're either fiddling at the margins or this is a masterclass in sort of just fudging, cooking the books, basically.
Yep.
I guess also just on the final point on planning and house building, we're currently running a deficit of 4.9 million homes, and that's increasing. Building 1.3 million homes is not going to cut it. And at the rate of migration that we currently have, those 1.3 million homes are going to people from essentially from overseas.
70% of new homes are going to go to new migrants. And that is under the OBR's projections, where the OBR's annual migration projections have been wrong by a factor of 3 or 4 thanks to the Boris wave. And despite Keir Starmer saying that this was a one-nation experiment in open borders, global Britain, he then decided to don the lab coat and continue it because levels of migration have been consistent under the Labour government. Now, they could end this tomorrow, as Sam Bidwell has written eloquently about before, with a stroke of the Whitehall pen and not passing primary legislation by suspending indefinite leave to remain, as Kimmy Badenoch has advised. She's advised it a little less stringently than Bidwell has, but nonetheless, Yvette Cooper could spare us all the £234 billion bill of these unproductive migrants staying here after 5 years forever and going on welfare, by just changing the time span at which you can claim indefinite leave to remain. They're refusing to do that. So they're presenting these like fiscal, demographic and cultural time bombs to the electorate and then just going, well, you know, we've got the scissors and it's hovering over the cord, but we'd rather not snip it for reasons. As far as tax rises as well, and I will point this out, they said we're not raising taxes on working people. Now, they've reneged on their promise not to raise council tax because that's going to go up and that's going to hit homeowners as well. So if you actually want to buy one of those brand new homes, good luck affording it. They are raising energy bills because Ed Miliband, is under his new Quango GB Energy spending, as we've just announced, another 200 million on solar panels for hospitals and schools. And they've also just voted against banning the import of solar panels from the Xinjiang region using slave labor because China produces 80% of global solar panels and Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps produce 40% of the materials that go into said solar panels. And they've gone, well, you know, we're kind of comfortable with human rights abuses so long as we can impose high energy renewables costs on our population. Britain already has the highest level of energy costs in the developed world. So all of those things are going to hit working people. But also what's going to hit working people is unemployment. The OBR thinks that unemployment is going to go up because of this stuff. It's notable that the CIPD are forecasting job losses as well, and business confidence is at an all-time low. And thanks to the £25 billion rise in employer-side national insurance, which is basically the extra tax that you pay on income to subsidise the NHS and pensions, this is going to make employing people on PAYE, so full-time salaries, prohibitively expensive. So either redundancy is going to be made or new hires are not going to be made and businesses are going to cut costs, meaning that the growth is going to shrink in the long term. And what's even worse is that Labour have an employment rights bill coming up. They're saying it protects workers' rights. Well, it only has protections of workers' rights insofar as you can get work. And the OBR think that this is going to be pretty catastrophic, as they put in their briefings. But they couldn't cost how catastrophic it is because strategically, Labour only presented them with the outline of the Workers' Rights Bill on the day of the budget, so they couldn't factor it in. So even if the OBR's modelling is right, and it's very questionable, I mean, look at what they did to Liz Truss, frankly, leaking the briefings, getting it wrong, undercounting tax receipts by, I think, 30 billion when it was much better than they thought it was going to be around the time of the mini-budget. The OBR can't provide us with the numbers as to how bad Labour's regulation for growth is going to be on businesses because Labour have decided to omit said numbers at the exact time that it would have been reported and made it look even worse for Rachel from accounts. So the entire thing is just a complete shambles.
Soup. This dovetails nicely, we just touched on it, on those Home Office asylum contracts. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what the situation is there.
Yes, so we are now spending 5.5 million a day, and that's at the low end of the estimate, on hotel fees for illegal migrants. Now, we have had 6,100 at time of recording cross the English Channel, break into Britain via small boat since January. This has been now a 30,300 total since Labour came to power last July. That's a 40% increase on the year prior. So it's something about Keir Starmer that seems magnetic to these people smuggling gangs he promised he would smash and hasn't done a single one. Also, they keep saying that deportations are up. This isn't true. Voluntary returns are up to nations like Brazil and Western Europe, which means that we are paying people to go home with a few £1,000 stipend when a Ryanair flight is 15 quid. So actually, Labour are not getting a handle on illegal immigration. It's getting much worse. And so now, what a new Quango that Rachel Reeves has set up has promised. This is the Treasury Department's Office for Value for Money, paradoxically named because it's another government Quango taking taxpayers' money to sit around looking at spreadsheets all day. They have said that of these 1.5 million new homes promised, the target being very unlikely for building to ever be met, that a certain section of these will be portioned off as dispersed accommodation for asylum seekers, illegal migrants. And the justification for this is that it costs £145 a day to house an illegal migrant in a hotel. Again, the budget previously 14.4 billion for 2023, looking to be 32.7 billion for 2025. Instead, it's £45 a night £14 a night to host them in dispersed private accommodation. Under the Conservative government, they were walking around and procuring private rental properties for this purpose. This is during said housing crisis. So the government is using your taxpayer money to buy up homes that you are trying to save to afford, to put up illegal migrants at your expense. It's an entirely perverted scheme.
Huge upward pressure on property prices as a result.
Quite. And at the same time, of these 1.5 million homes being built, a certain section of them going to illegal migrants as part of what Angela Rayner once called Operation Scatter, to, quote, equitably disperse illegal immigrants around every borough in the country. OBR project at least 1.5 million migrants will be let in order to build those homes in the first place. We have former Chancellor Lord Philip Hammond going on Times Radio and Sky News yesterday saying that a degree of managed migration, which is a former Labour Home Secretary Barbara Roach's phrase, is necessary in order for this house building to go ahead, and that Labour need to expend political capital in convincing the public that this is necessary, even though migration is the least popular position for all parties in the country. So, pretty astounding stuff that, as we said about Treasury orthodoxy, despite this massive bill coming in from the Boris wave, immigration is still seen as a net good, either through necessary skills, which never seem to be filled, or because just increasing raw GDP is the priority, and you only do that by increasing the population, never increasing productivity or never increasing GDP per capita. So, essentially, if you're a law-abiding British taxpayer, you're getting the shortest, bluntest possible end of every stick.
Yeah, I guess so. The problem with sort of the Treasury approach to all of these things is the ledger just isn't big enough, right? You have the Treasury, working out the sort of doing a cost benefit analysis in certain discrete areas, and the numbers just do not match up across each of those areas. Hence why you have to bring people in to build and then actually not factor in how much they will be drawing from the state in terms of, essential services, schooling, NHS fees.
Or just needing somewhere to live like every human being does.
Exactly. So that's pretty damning, I suppose. And then lastly, and I think we'll just touch on it really quickly because we can speak about it at more length later on, next week, for example. Islamophobia. This Islamophobia bill. What can you tell me about the government's proposals in this area?
So this is actually connected to the prior topic because as the IMF projected in October, there will be an increased number of anti-immigration protests going forward, and this presents a particular fiscal barrier to economies because they, again, believe immigration is a net good. And it connects to the first topic because cultural fracturing is likely to increase this stuff. And so in order to manage the mess that they have created, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, Angela Rayner, has decided to convene an Islamophobia blasphemy board, which I've written about for Courage before.
Emphasis on the plural there, communities.
Yes. Yeah. Communities which exclude the settled white British population of the country.
But also just this idea that there can be no community,
Yes. There is no we, there is no our.
No, everyone's in their siloed places.
Though interesting that this Islamophobia definition, which previously was written by the Muslim Council of Britain in conjunction with Health Secretary Wes Streeting and Hope Not Hate, which said that Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism that targets Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It's about as robust as the what is a woman definition that was kicking about a few years ago. It's interesting that has now been thrown out in favour of a new definition because one of the Equalities advisors to the government said that actually violates the Equalities Act. So they're still pressing for a definition of Islamophobia, but one that doesn't violate their own laws that they want to keep in place. And so there's now the new law that targets sort of perceptions of Muslimness that's led by Dominic Grieve, who is a former anti-Brexit Tory MP and Attorney General who violated the Whitehall ban on engaging with the Muslim Council of Britain after one of its deputy leaders signed the Istanbul Declaration, which was perceived as a mandate to fire on British naval vessels that were in Palestinian waters. Grieve violated that by going to an awards dinner in 2011 while working under the Cameron government. He is now heading this up. He wrote the foreword to that former Islamophobia report. And this definition will include Islamophobia towards Buddhists, Sikhs, and Hindus in case they are perceived as being Muslims. So what it actually is, it's a law that targets white Britons on the grounds that they're less likely to be mistaken for a Muslim, Christians and Jews, because of their religious garb and beliefs, they're less likely to share commonalities with the Muslim population. So this is yet another example of a two-tier justice system.
But it is also essentially a thought crime.
Yeah.
It's all intentions-based.
Yes, exactly. And the most insidious part of this, as Toby Young has mentioned before, is it probably won't require primary legislation. Instead, much like this new sentencing council guidance that punishes straight white men and gives them more stringent sentences because they don't get a pre-sentencing report that might lighten their sentence because they're members of marginalised communities, this will probably just be passed through with policing and judicial guidance. So it won't even be fought in Parliament. This will just be another quango of demented activists like Qari Asim, who's a Leeds imam but also a trustee of Hope Not Hate, that's passing this law to benefit aggrieved community interest groups at the behest of the law-abiding, settled, non-troublemaking population. And this is yet another totalitarian overreach to manage the so-called benefits of diversity.